Hi there. Thank you so much. I'm just wondering, can
Hello.
people... Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to introduce myself. My name's Ailsa Rutter. I'm the Director of Fresh and Balance, and I'm absolutely delighted that we've got so many people signed up for today's quarterly Lunch and Learn webinar, which we do as the Fresh team alongside the fantastic Smoke-Free NHS programme, which is ICB funded and based with us as well. I'm just going to check that that people can see my slides.
Yes, we can.
Yes, you can. Wonderful. Thank you so much. We've had a slight little delay starting today because we've had a slight little technical hiccup, but hopefully everything will go according to plan. So as I say, my name's Ailsa Rutter. I'm the Director of Fresh and Balance. And I'm just going to run through a few quick little slides here before we hand over to Harry today. So this, as I said, is the Fresh and Smoke-Free NHS Lunchtime webinar. We have this on a quarterly basis. It's open to absolutely anybody who's interested in tobacco control, as long as they're not working for the tobacco industry. And really what I wanted to just do is a quick little scene set until we do a deep dive into our topic today, which is nicotine pouches. Why we're all here, why Fresh, the programme exists, is because we're absolutely really clear that, you know, there is still a huge amount to be done in terms of ending the horrific toll that combustible tobacco has on our communities and our loved ones. It's nearly 8 million lives have been lost to tobacco since 1971. In fact, it's 26% of all deaths in the last 50 years due to the tobacco industry peddling lethal combustible tobacco products. And this is just a montage of some of our loved ones from the northeast here. So an introduction to Fresh and who we are. I think most people today will definitely know who we are. We are a population level programme. We've been working for 20 years now. Can I just ask everyone to mute, please, who aren't speaking? That would be wonderful. Thanks so much. So the Fresh programme's been running for 20 years. You can find out more about our work and the work of our sister programme Balance, which is the alcohol programme, and the multi-strand approach that we take. And we've been consistently working across these 8 key strands for the last 20 years, recognising that there isn't a single magic kind of solution in terms of reducing smoking and narrowing health inequalities. But these are all very much based upon the evidence base, and they very much are around working synergistically to reduce smoking rates, promoting support to stop, to help people to stop smoking, stay stopped, to reduce uptake and to protect from secondhand and other related harm. Part of the rationale today and why we've all come together here today is to really grapple with the growing phenomenon around nicotine pouches and what they may help with, what they may be problematic for and things. But if we think about the great progress all of us collectively together have made as a region. In fact, if anybody doesn't know, we have actually reduced smoking, all of us together, by the most of any region in England. And officially, according to the APS, we're now the second lowest smoking rate of any region. But as part of what we're trying to do is to make sure that we have a system-wide approach to maximising quitting, that we really recognise that the person who smokes is at the centre of much of our plans, and that we just need to give people as many opportunities as possible to quit smoking through giving them choice, through recognising there's lots of different routes to quit. And also it's a chronic relapsing long-term condition, and we need to just keep going and to make sure that we constantly are looking at that. We have made excellent progress, but we're not complacent as a region. The North East has a very clear vision of the future that we want. We're very much looking at this from a health inequalities lens, that this is still our greatest driver of health inequalities, and there is no room for complacency. And we're absolutely, so delighted with the ongoing commitment from across the many leaders in our region, whether they be in local authorities, whether they be in the NHS at acute trust level, or also the brilliant work that our North East North Cumbria ICB do. And this is why we are the only region that has united in terms of having a very clear declaration for a smoke-free future. We support a smoke-free future free of the death and disease from tobacco. And something's just happened. Oh, I think we've got Harry's slides now. Is that right, Joanna?
Yeah, are you finished, or do you have anything else left to say, Ailsa?
Yep, back to me. Apologies. Yep, don't know what happened there. So, yep, My slides have disappeared. I'm just bringing them back. Can you
They're
see?
back on. They are back on, yeah.
Right. So it was just to say we've got a very clear declaration for a smoke-free future. So just that strategic scene set. But today's deep dive, and we do these on a quarterly basis, is a specific topic. And this is a topic that many people had said to us, could you come and run a session with the local Tobacco Alliance? And we actually thought it would be really good to open this out to everybody here today. And we're certainly not the experts in nicotine pouches, which is why we're absolutely delighted that Dr. Harry Tattan Birch is here with us. He's a senior research fellow and statistician in the absolutely brilliant team that is in University College London. I couldn't thank this team enough. They lead the Smoking and Alcohol in England toolkits. They're really brilliant, very flexible. You know, their productivity is off the scale, actually. But Harry is here today because his primary focus of research is looking at the impact of novel nicotine products such as e-cigs, heated tobacco and nicotine pouches. And he's in this session that Harry's going to run with us today. He's going to present on the latest research into nicotine pouches, a rapidly growing category of nicotine products. He's going to look at, you know, who's using them, highlighting demographic trends and some of the potential public health implications. Things like, you know, are they being used potentially as a harm reduction tool for smokers? But also, are there any associated risks associated with their increasing popularity? So he'll be looking at that. There's going to be plenty of time for questions at the end and a discussion. And just from a housekeeping point of view, this webinar is being recorded. We'll upload it to the Fresh Local Tobacco Control K-Hub and also the group we run on for Smoke Free NHS. We'll also put it on the Fresh YouTube channel. To just make it seamless, please keep your microphone muted. I'm sure everybody will absolutely be very respectful of colleagues here today. There may be some differing opinions. Please use the chat function. This will be monitored by Joanna, who's done a brilliant job to set up today's webinar. And you'll also have opportunity to provide feedback through the online survey. And also, just last but not least, we're always seeking suggestions from you for future topics. So thanks so much for coming along today. I'm going to hand over to Harry now, and then I'll see you again shortly. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I hope I can live up to that introduction. That was great. Thanks. I'm just uploading my slides now, so they should come up very shortly.
Thank you.
Can you all hear me okay?
We can hear you, Harry. Yep, perfect. Definitely. And it's coming up now. Yep, there
Amazing,
you go.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So yeah, thanks for that introduction. So I'm going to be talking about the rise of nicotine pouch use in Great Britain. And I'll be trying to whip through these slides pretty quickly, but we're going to be covering what are nicotine pouches, because there's a lot of confusion in the media among people and also in regulations, who's using them and why it's important, like putting it in the context of everything else going on with nicotine and smoking. So first off, what are nicotine pouches? So nicotine pouches are small white bags that you put under the lip where they deliver nicotine. And importantly, they don't contain tobacco leaf and there's no combustion. And because we know that most of the harms from smoking come from the combustion of tobacco, they're likely to be substantially less harmful to health than cigarette smoking. Although not harmless, of course, because they still contain nicotine. And they've been in Great Britain since about 2019, and slightly before then, they were introduced in Scandinavia. But the problem is that regulators are struggling to answer the question, what are nicotine pouches? Because they don't really fit into any of the existing regulations. They're not a tobacco product, so they're not covered by tobacco regulation, and they're not a vape, so they're not covered by the vape regulation. So they sort of fall into this regulatory black hole where there's no specific regulation on pouches. And as a result of this, there's no minimum age of sale. So legally, there's nothing stopping people from selling them to children. And there's real concerns about use among children because of their concealability, so they can be used in schools, say, without teachers knowing. There's no nicotine cap on the limit of the amount of nicotine per pouch, and there's some pouches that are being sold at really, really high strengths, and there's some dare I say, amusing stories from some people like Gary Lineker about using too high strength nicotine pouches and having terrible experiences. But obviously, we don't want that to spread throughout the population of acute nicotine toxicity. And also, there's limited advertising restrictions. And Tianzi Sun and I published a paper on this called Sports Gigs and TikToks. And the title sort of tells you exactly the sort of advertising strategies that are being used. But just quickly, anyone who's into F1 will know that cigarettes used to be a big part of F1 and being advertised across lots of different teams' cars. And now Velo from British American Tobacco sponsor McLaren. Most music festivals in the UK, every major one that I've seen, has a sponsorship from one of the nicotine pouch companies. And they're also being handed out at bars, free samples at bars, in train stations, even in bookshops. And then finally, online, there's a big spread of marketing, both paid, so like direct adverts from the companies, but also unpaid media, which is just people talking about using the products. So because of these issues, the Tobacco and Vapes Bill has come in, and part of the Tobacco and Vapes Bill doesn't actually look at tobacco and vapes. It brings nicotine pouches into the regulation, that the regulatory framework that vapes will also be under. So that will give the powers to restrict nicotine content, advertising, and sales to children. So that's a good bill in my view. But just to say, while the legislation sort of plugs these glaring issues, an important question for future policy and public health is we need to know how harmful a pouch is and what are they being used for. So first, in terms of the harm, I want to introduce you to the idea of a continuum of risk when we talk about harms. So almost everything in life has some risk. So the question with most behaviors is not, is there a risk, but how risky is it compared to the alternatives? To take skydiving, it's not risk-free, but the risk changes massively depending on how you do it. So if you sit at home watching skydiving on the TV, that's obviously the safest way to sort of have a form of that experience. Option 2, you could go skydiving indoors in an air chamber, with the only risk being sort of bumping into the walls of the air chamber, getting some bruises. Option 3 is skydiving with a parachute, which is, yes, very risky compared to other things you can be doing as you are falling out of a plane. But with a parachute and backups, it's a managed risk. And then option 4 is skydiving without a parachute, which is less of a continuum, more of a one-way ticket, to be honest. But that sort of shows how this broad behavior, skydiving, can have very different risks depending on how you go about doing it. So then if we apply the same concept to nicotine products, so cigarettes are not quite as instantly deadly as jumping out of a plane without a parachute, but they're not that far off, because over 50% of people who smoke throughout their lives will die because of it. So it is a huge risk to someone's health. So less risky than that is vaping, substantially less risky, because while it still involves nicotine, it doesn't involve combustion of tobacco, which, as I said before, is what causes most of the harms from smoking. The cancer, most of the heart disease, and the COPD. So you've cut out the most harmful product, part of the nicotine experience, and reduce the harm. Next down the risk continuum, you've got nicotine pouches. And I think they go here because they don't involve inhalation of anything into the lungs, which may have its own risks with vaping that nicotine pouches don't have. The only remaining risks are really the risks of nicotine, high doses of nicotine. And then finally, no use at all, which is the lowest risk. So the key point is, what matters is not the absolute risk of one product in isolation, but you have to look at the person who's using the product and think, what would they otherwise be doing? If it's someone who smokes, switches to pouches, their risk goes down dramatically. if someone who never would have smoked or vaped starts using pouches, their risk goes up compared to doing nothing. So whether a pouch use is a good thing or a bad thing depends on who's doing it and what they would otherwise be doing. And you might ask, how do we know nicotine pouches sit here on the continuum? And I think even more so than vapes, we actually have quite good evidence relating to this. And that's because of the precedent of snus, which is a tobacco version of nicotine pouches that became popular in Sweden in the mid-1900s. But note that it's banned in the EU and the UK, so you obviously don't see much use elsewhere. And because it's been around for a long time, there's decades of long-term epidemiological evidence on the health risks of using snus. And it shows that risks exist, but they're far lower than what happens from smoking. And especially in terms of cancer risks, there's not even a clear association with oral cancers. Like if there is an association, it's very small. And something that's useful as a natural experiment, but sort of tragic, is that we saw in Sweden, men switched to snus from smoking, but women didn't until much later. So you can see in that graph that the yellow sort of engulfing the tobacco use among men, but in women, the blue, which is the smoking, remains relatively high until recently. And as a result of men mostly switching, you can see what's happened to disease outcomes in those groups. So in Swedish women, they have relatively similar lung cancer incidence as the rest of Europe, so actually slightly higher. Whereas when you look at men, they have the lowest by far in Europe and much, much lower than the average level of lung cancer incidence in Europe, showing how when a less harmful product replaces cigarettes, this can lead to dramatic improvements in population health. So how does this apply to the tobacco-free nicotine pouches that we see in the UK? So they're essentially snus without tobacco leaf, which in theory should make them less risky because there's none of the compounds in tobacco that can cause harm present, or they're at least present in much lower quantities, just trace amounts from the extraction of nicotine from the tobacco process. So it's likely even lower risk than from snus, but we need standards to ensure that there's not additives to these new products that are leading to additional harms. And the critical question then is whether we'll see the same trajectory in Great Britain as we saw in Sweden over the past century, i.e. will pouches primarily displace smoking, bringing health gains, or will they start to attract young people who'd otherwise not use nicotine, creating additional harms? And that's what I'm going to explore in the next section, who's actually using them. So who is using them? To look at this, we use data from the Smoking Toolkit study. So this is a representative survey of adults in Great Britain, where samples of people every month are interviewed through telephone interviews by Ipsos Mori. And they give us the data, and then we can analyze it within a month of getting it, which is really, really useful for stuff like this, where it's a rapidly changing nicotine market, and we need to know what's going on in real time with the products. And I'll cut straight to it. So here's the overall rate of current nicotine pouch use among adults in Great Britain from October 2020 to April 2025. And you'll see the absolute rate is low across the whole period, but it's increased substantially, about tenfold, from 1 in 1,000 people using it in 2020 to 1 in 100 in 2025. So while it seems like 1% of the population is not very big, that is over 500,000 people. And the increase shows how pouch use is moving from a niche behavior to more part of the mainstream. I saw a comment about sound issues.
Your sound's coming through clear.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's becoming more of a mainstream behavior. And this is even more clear if you look in specific population groups, because the rise in nicotine pouch use has not been the same across different groups, most notably by age. So if we look by age, you can see the stark differences where that increase in use in pouches is basically only occurs in those younger age groups, sort of from 16 to 35, maybe 45. But in those older age groups, it's basically a flat line across. And in fact, if you look at the 16 to 24-year-olds, pouch use rose fivefold between 2022 and 2025, reaching 4%. And if we break this down even further, it's even more interesting. So if we split it by age and gender, we'll see that it's basically being driven by a massive increase among young men. So that top left line is the young age group of 16 to 24-year-old men. And you can see how it's sort of shot up. And by 2025, we see that 7.5% of people of men in that age group report currently using nicotine pouches. So yeah, it's a disproportionate product used by young men. And if that trend continues, it could become one of the most dominant products in that age group. Interestingly, we see similar rates of use in England, Scotland, and Wales, and across different social grades. So ABC1 is like the more advantaged occupational group, and C2D the less advantaged. And you see the lines are overlapping each other, showing that the trends are relatively similar. But one of the most important questions is whether these pouch users are nicotine naive, i.e., like, are they using other nicotine products alongside the pouches? And the answer to that is mostly not. Most are using other nicotine products. Nearly 70% of users also smoke or vape, with more than half being current smokers, and yet only 16% report having never regularly smoked. So we know that while some uptake is occurring in nicotine naive people, that small 16%, most pouch use so far is layered on top of smoking and vaping. So it would be good to know also, among people who do smoke and use pouches, what are they using pouches for? Unfortunately, we have data on this. So we looked at pouch use for quitting smoking and for cutting down on smoking. And if we look at quitting, this graph shows the percentage of attempts to quit smoking where someone uses pouches as an aid. And you can see it's increasing over time, such that now 6.5% of quit attempts involve a pouch, people using pouches. And that might seem relatively small, but it's actually higher than the amount using varenicline or prescription NRT combined. So there's more people using pouches than any of the licensed medications. That suggests they're becoming a more important part of smokers' quitting strategies. But as I'll mention later, we don't actually know if they're effective for this purpose yet. The second thing we looked at is smoking is used for cutting down on smoking. And here we also see increases, with now around 2% of people who smoke saying that they're using pouches to cut down. Obviously, the benefits mostly come from quitting entirely, not just cutting down, but it's useful to see them increasingly be used as a substitute for smoking regardless. And so why does this matter? I think when we're thinking about how this matters and putting it in the policy context and what practitioners should do, we need to think about the upsides and the downsides of pouches. So in terms of the upsides, they may help people to quit smoking. They're increasingly being used for this reason, as I just showed you, but we still don't know whether they're effective for that. We need randomized controlled trials looking at whether giving someone a pouch is better than giving them other nicotine replacement therapy or, say, a vape at getting them to quit smoking. They're also a slightly different point is that they might be used as an alternative to ever starting smoking. So this is obviously more difficult to measure because you have to think about a counterfactual world where pouches didn't exist. But if pouches and other like lower risk nicotine products start to replace cigarettes as the product that people start using when they're experimenting as a young person, say, then that would actually be a good thing for public health. And then the third point is they might even be a substitute for vaping, because as I showed you that continuum of risk before, they probably sit slightly lower on the continuum of risk than even vaping. So people, and I've heard of people quitting vaping using pouches. And then in terms of the downsides, first, there's concern about uptake among children. And we've already seen strong marketing aimed at young audiences and reports from schools of pouch use in the classroom. Obviously, the lack of an age of sale restriction is concerning there. But that links to another issue: use among people who would otherwise never have taken up nicotine, and that's the counter side of the fact that they might be an alternative to starting smoking. It's that they might lead people to start using nicotine who otherwise would never have done so. And then finally, there's this risk that I mentioned before of high dose products on the market causing toxicity if people have large amounts of nicotine in one go. So there should be a cap there to stop that from happening. So yeah, the overall picture is mixed, with the products having potential benefits, but also important risks, which is why policy is needed to sort of maximize these upsides while minimizing the downsides. And I'm just going to discuss quickly what some other countries are doing, and including the UK actually, to strike this balance. So in terms of the UK, we've got the Tobacco and Vapes Bill, which will straight away ban the age of sale below 18-year-olds. Will restrict some advertising and give powers to regulate flavours and nicotine levels. And I think it would be wise to put a cap on the nicotine levels that's high enough that the products remain rewarding for smokers, but not so high that the risk of acute nicotine toxicity occurs. And as with all regulations, implementation and enforcement will be key here. As we've seen with the disposable vape ban, you've now got products that look identical to disposable vapes but have a USB port and pods. So legally they are reusable, but then you can't actually seem to find pods anywhere for them in the high street. So most people are probably just throwing them away after a single use. That's why we need to be careful in how the regulation is specifically being phrased and implemented to avoid any issues there. And in terms of the US, they've actually authorized for sale 20 Zen nicotine pouch products in different flavors and strengths. And they made this judgment based on the lower cancer and disease risks than cigarettes and many smokeless tobacco products. The FDA made that decision. However, lots of countries in the rest of Europe have taken a more draconian approach. So Spain is introducing a nicotine cap of 2 milligrams, which is just too low for many users. A recent study we saw most users were actually using somewhere between 10 and 20 milligrams of nicotine per pouch. In the US, I think it's closer to 3 to 6 milligrams. In any case, 2 milligrams is so low that they're basically not going to be rewarding for smokers. So it's going to stop them being used as an alternative to smoking, and we're not going to get any of the benefits for quitting smoking or as a substitute for ever starting smoking. And then other countries in Europe are going even further with planned bans entirely on nicotine pouches, even when cigarettes are widely available in some of these countries. And some of these countries don't have strong tobacco control regulations on cigarettes. So they're essentially protecting the market for the most harmful product, most harmful nicotine product. And I think that highlights why we need to really think in terms of the continuum of risk, regulating in a way that makes the least harmful products the most accessible, not the other way around. And you can do that by either by further whenever you put a restriction on these lower risk nicotine products, it makes sense to put restrictions as well, or even stronger restrictions on the most harmful products. What doesn't make sense is leaving very lax regulation on the most harmful products while banning or putting very heavy restrictions on the less harmful ones. And if we just return to the lessons from Sweden, the Swedish story of snus, that shows us what can happen when regulation allows a less harmful product to compete with cigarettes. So in Sweden, snus remained legal and widely available, and as a result, lots of men switched to snus, and this contributed to some of the lowest lung cancer rates in Europe among Swedish men. Actually, the lowest lung cancer incidence. By contrast, in the rest of the EU, snus was banned, so as a result, cigarettes remained the dominant product, and the countries missed out on the potential substitution and health benefits as a result. And in Great Britain today, as we've seen, pouches are mostly used by people who smoke or vape, but also disproportionately by young people. So they could play a positive role in harm reduction if the substitution continues, where people are using them as alternative to smoking. But we do also need to be cautious, because we saw prior to 2021, e-cigarettes were almost exclusively used by people as an alternative to smoking. Yet post 2021, where the introduction of these brightly coloured, marketed everywhere disposable vapes, we saw a rapid rise in popularity among young people who've never smoked. And cigarette smoking uptake in young people still remains high despite the high vaping rates. So the picture can change quickly, and we need to make sure that the regulation isn't leading to this uptick in use in people who have never smoked. And so what's next in terms of research and policy? Well, I think we need more RCT evidence into the effectiveness of pouches at helping people to quit smoking. And I'm involved in a Cochrane review on this topic. And I can't give you the full results, but basically the picture is there's still lots of question marks. We still need more research. Second, we need longitudinal monitoring so we can see whether pouches lead to smoking displacement or they just layer on top of additional existing nicotine use. And we also need that evidence to get precise estimates of the long-term harms of using pouches compared to, say, vaping or smoking. Because we do have the evidence from snus, but we want direct evidence from nicotine pouches as well. And third, we need careful, proportionate regulation that protects young people from uptake. I think some of the advertising that's being done needs to be restricted, and so does an age of sale ban and potentially some other restrictions on the content in nicotine pouches. But we always need to keep in mind the broader context of nicotine use. So just to summarize what I've talked about today, what are nicotine pouches? They're tobacco-free nicotine products that one places under the lip, which are likely to be much less harmful than cigarettes and probably less harmful than vapes, but we need more evidence on that. They're being aggressively marketed because there's a lack of specific regulation on them. Okay, and who's using them? The most common user, the typical user, is a young man who also smokes or vapes, but there's also some variation there. And now there's 500,000 pouch users in the UK, and that is growing. So it's becoming an increasingly important part of the nicotine landscape. And why does it matter? Because these products could, in theory, contribute to harm reduction if they replace smoking, like we saw with snus in Sweden. But there's also risks, because if they instead lead lots of people who'd otherwise avoid nicotine to take up products, then that could lead to a net public health harm. and I've just got a key takeaway before I finish. If cigarettes are like jumping out of a plane without a parachute, then vaping or pouches are like the parachute. They're not risk-free, but they're the difference between what's a certain harm to a managed risk. And the real danger, I think, is that you take away the parachute while free-fall smoking remains widely available, leaving people with no choice but to take the most harmful option. And that's what a lot of European countries seem to be doing. And thanks to my co-authors on this study. And please do contact me and connect with me on LinkedIn and X or Blue Sky, whatever version of Twitter you prefer the most. And then you can find the preprint in this link, or if you scan this QR code. And I'd be happy to answer some questions. Thanks, everyone.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Harry. That was really fantastic overview and a very logical way of talking us through what we know so far, what we don't know, and I suppose some of that moral dilemma. And I think it was really helpful, your equilibrium of risk that you presented there. So I've been monitoring the chat, and we've had some really useful questions that I might just clump them into a couple of ones. So we've had a question around, do they cause cancer, and if there are any risks to oral health? So I wonder, and also, is snus the same as nicotine pouches? Could you just take that one first, please?
Yeah, so I'll take the snus versus nicotine pouches. So I'll just put this slide on to show. So snus is traditionally used to describe pouches that contain tobacco rather than tobacco-free nicotine pouches. Whereas when I say nicotine pouches, I'm referring to the white pouches on the right there. But some people, and in common language, people do tend to call the pouches on the right snus. Sometimes you hear the phrase brown snus or white snus. But in research, when we talk about nicotine pouches, we're talking about the white nicotine pouches. And it's important to note that snus is banned in the EU and the UK, whereas the white nicotine pouches are legally available. Because I've actually seen a lot of high-profile news articles that say that pouches are banned in the UK when they're not. They're confusing that with the tobacco-containing snus. And in terms of oral health issues, so with snus, it's sort of there's no clear, strong association with oral cancer, which I even found surprising, because I thought you might see a risk because of the tobacco-specific nitrous amines that you have in tobacco when placed on the gum. But the thing is that there's quite high standards on the products that are produced in Sweden, so they remove a lot of these harmful compounds from the products, and as a result, I think you don't see the strong association with cancers, and obviously there's not association with lung cancer. So there might be some small risk. It's still a bit uncertain, but it's nothing to the scale of smoking, not even close. And there's other oral health problems though, like people who use pouches can have lesions in the area where they use the pouch. It can cause this sort of nasty sort of recession in the gum, where on the side that they tend to use their pouches, which is why people often, when they're advising people to use pouches, I've heard dentists say to swap where you're putting them. But again, I think this is all the sort of thing that the product safety standards should be looking into to ensure that the products on the market, we minimize these risks of oral health issues.
Really helpful. Thank you so much. There's a question around pouches becoming available to give to patients in the same way as NRT. I'm assuming, Harry, we're going to need more definitive research to show that they could be medicinally licensed in that way. And I'm guessing that's where the Cochrane review is going to be pivotal.
Yeah, exactly. And I know there's ongoing randomized controlled trials looking at the effectiveness of giving out pouches. And I think there are some companies that are looking to license them as medications, but based on them being similar to other nicotine replacement therapy products that you use orally.
Okay.
Like you
Okay.
have lozenges and chewing gums, say.
Okay.
But at the moment, I don't think so. I think there needs to be a bit more direct evidence on them.
Yeah. Can I ask it as chair's prerogative? Can I ask a question in terms of nicotine per se, and trying to recognize, you know, that I guess it's not, when people die from smoking, they're dying from all of the other toxic chemicals. Nicotine is the thing that keeps people addictive, but in itself, it isn't the really harmful product. But when we talk about nicotine naivety and people who wouldn't have otherwise used nicotine, I guess where I'm grappling with is, and particularly with children and young people, and absolutely recognizing we don't want them using products. But I'm supposing, Harry, wearing your broader hat around other risky products and things, how the use of nicotine relates in comparison to other things. And I'm wearing my balance hat here in terms of alcohol and other things that we know can have an impact, particularly on young people's brain development, etc. Have you got any thoughts you can share in terms of how worried people should be around nicotine use in a form like this?
Yeah, I think like as in the use of nicotine in young people, there's a lot of concerns, as you say, about whether it's going to affect their brains in the long run. But I'm not convinced by the evidence based on that, and a lot of people aren't either. That it's the associations you see with early nicotine use and sort of negative psychological and behavioural outcomes are actually related to the nicotine use and not other factors that led someone to use nicotine in the first place. So, for instance, we know that there's this strong association with mental ill health and using nicotine, which could in part be due to the nicotine causing negative effects, but also we know that people with those problems seek a thing that will reduce the symptoms. Say someone with ADHD might find that nicotine helps them concentrate. Even in the long run, if the dependence actually leads to worse concentration overall. But in terms of like long-term damage to the brain, I think some of the communication from some public health bodies, I think, is a bit misleading, because we know that there was a time 70 years ago, say, where huge proportions of the population were smoking during adolescence, and we didn't see like substantial like issues as they later went into adulthood. The issues came not from their brain, but from all the other problems that smoking causes. So I'd be much more concerned about alcohol use in that age group in terms of the long-term neurological effects.
Okay. Really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Questions, Harry, how on average how much they cost and how do pouches compare also to microtab NRT? So the cost question, and then Joanna's asking about, you know, actually is microtab NRT currently the closest medicinally licensed thing to a nicotine pouch?
Yeah, it probably is. I don't know, how much does the microtab NRT cost for like so pouches cost around like £6 to £7. You can get them for a bit cheaper if you buy in bulk or from some dodgy online store. But like in the supermarkets and most news agents, they'll be £6-7 for a pack of 20. So it's cheaper, and there's a lot of, you can have a very strong nicotine content pouches being sold for that. So that would be like much cheaper than the equivalent number of cigarettes, and definitely much cheaper than the equivalent amount of nicotine someone would get from the cigarettes. If that makes sense.
Right, I've got two other questions here. One's probably easy, and then the other one is very, very philosophical from Joanna. But I'll ask the quick one first. What other products are actually in the pouch along with the nicotine? That's from Karina.
Yeah, so there's the sort of the bulk of it. I can't remember the exact phrase used, But most of the products in nicotine pouches, especially from the major brands, are things that you would find in other oral products like chewing gums. They tend, and I'm much less concerned about the potential risk of additives there, because we have like a lot of evidence on flavorings when they're used in the mouth, like with chewing gum. So yeah, but then there have been reports of some pouches containing tobacco-specific nitrous amines in high levels, which is worrying because you shouldn't be seeing that in a product that doesn't contain tobacco. So there's probably they've used some bad form of nicotine extraction from the tobacco that's left these negative components in it. So yeah, I think there does need to be better product standard regulations on them.
Okay, thank you. So the big question. So I mentioned at the beginning that the Northeasters have got a collective vision for a totally smoke-free future, and by that we're talking about combustible tobacco products. We're very much focusing around getting people off the most lethal thing and free of the death and disease of tobacco. What we haven't said as part of that is we're saying necessarily a nicotine-free future, because I think particularly there's lots of people on the call today who work with priority population groups, serious mental illness, etc., and are successfully using much less harmful nicotine products, some probably for the long term as such. So Joanna has asked a question, a devil's advocate question. If in 20 years' time smoking rates have got down to 0%, but novel nicotine use was, say, 10 or 20%, big question, what would be the public health impact? Joanna, that's a really tough question for Harry in 2 minutes.
Well, I don't. It would depend on what the counterfactual is, right? If we're say we're comparing that to, say there's 20% use of pouches and vaping and then 0% smoking. You would have to, if you compared that to 0% novel nicotine product use and 10% smoking, say half the smoking rate of the nicotine use, that would still, by all like measures of the relative risk of the products, you'd be much prefer from a public health perspective to have the 20% using novel nicotine products versus the 10% smoking, because smoking is just so harmful. So yeah, there's actually a nice paper looking at this by Ken Warner, I think, his team, where they map out the number of additional people who have never smoked or vaped, so people who would otherwise not smoke, who vape, that you would need to remove the public health benefit of one smoker quitting using a vape, like switching to vapes. And it's actually quite a lot. You need quite a lot of young people to start vaping to counteract the benefit of one smoker quitting using a vape.
Okay, really helpful, thank you. There's a question about whether they're owned by the tobacco companies or not, and I guess from our perspective as Fresh, what we're very keen to do is absolutely not have tobacco industry selling really known lethal products. But I'm guessing who currently owns the bulk of the nicotine pouch companies, and any views in relation to that, and how do we incentivize the industry to genuinely, if they say they want a totally smoke-free future, to actually mean that and not sell lethal products?
Yeah, exactly. So most of the major nicotine pouch brands are owned by tobacco industry. So Nordic Spirit's owned by Japan Tobacco, Velo's owned by British American Tobacco, Zin's owned by PMI, I think. So yeah, the ones that are advertised most widely are all owned by tobacco industry in some form. There are some small ones that are completely independent, but I'd say they make up a very small proportion of the market. And actually, the thing is, at the moment, most of the research has been done by the industry themselves on their products. There's not that much, so there's much more research into the industry-owned products than there are the independent pouches. So that's another issue. I think there just needs to be more research. and hopefully you'd see some company independent of the tobacco industry becoming the preferred product, because it is concerning when you see the tobacco industry talking about switching to less harmful products, but then you see what they're doing around the world, promoting their product, that's promoting cigarettes in new markets, and it's just disingenuous, isn't it?
Really interesting. So with 5 minutes to go, unless anybody else has got any burning questions, and by all means, as Harry has really kindly shared his contact details, you can reach out to him separately, or of course you can get in touch with Joanna and I, and we can collate some more questions, come back to you with specific answers. But I did just want to hugely thank Harry for that really thought-provoking whistle stop in terms of nicotine pouches. And I think this is very much work in progress, isn't it? And as I've said at the very beginning, we're exceptionally lucky in the UK to have the fantastic team at UCL and the other brilliant university colleagues around the country, that they do so much robust tobacco control research. We are very robust as a country in terms of how we monitor things, and I think that, all credit to them in terms of Cancer Research UK funding, the toolkit, etc. And I think when people sometimes say, we don't know enough about certain things, sometimes that's true, but actually quite often we do know a heck of a lot. And quite often it's because of the investment that has been done in research and things here. I did just want to quickly use the last 5 minutes, please, just in terms of when Harry's talked about the bill, where the bill is actually at right now, if that is okay. And I know, because as Tobacco Alliances, we always talk about advocacy, we talk about the bill and how important effective regulation is. So Harry's very clearly outlined some of the loopholes and why absolutely we support the tobacco and vapes bill. We must get rid of loopholes like being able to hand out free samples and no age restriction, and some of the really inappropriate packaging of some products, and some of the really inappropriate promotion and marketing. Officially, the bill's a little bit stuck and it's not quite at committee stage in the House of Lords yet. We are really hoping that a date will be set very soon, and because it's very important that we do get what we call royal assent as soon as possible, because there is lots of things in this bill and we're going to need the time around the things on the face of the bill, like raising the age of sale in terms of making it illegal to sell lethal combustible tobacco products to anybody born after 1st of January 2009. We know how much public support there is for this and stakeholder support. So that's why we are really keen to put a little bit of pressure actually on government to get their skates on. We also know there'll be lots of other consultations that will be needed on other things in it. And Catherine Taylor in our team leads upon that, and she's our regulation manager. So I did just want to flag to you that the fantastic team at ASH are collating signatories for people who may wish to consider in their own personal capacity signing a letter which will go to Secretary of State around about when Parliament comes back after recess. And this is a letter that may get tweaked as things develop over the next couple of weeks, but it's had hundreds and hundreds of signatures to it already, and it's to show your support and as to why we want to have the bill, discussed, debated in the House of Lords as soon as possible so we can get it to report stage. And also, if anybody wants to know a little bit more about what Fresh is doing around potential amendments to the bill and why we think it's really vital as a levy on the tobacco companies and things, we'd be happy to chat to you about that. But these are all key things that get discussed in Tobacco Alliances. So if you aren't involved with your local one, please join it. So that when we send out the slides, you'll be able to click into that link there and you'll be able to sign that letter, or I'm sure Joanna has already stuck it in the chat. So it
and I've already signed it as well.
Oh, thanks, Harry. Never in doubt. So it's just for anybody who isn't aware of who we are. This is a photograph of the team. As I say, we will be running these sessions quarterly. We have other things we do, like the community of interest, which Joanna runs for anybody that helps people who smoke to quit smoking. We're on all of the social media channels. And as I've said, this will be recorded and put onto YouTube alongside many of our other videos. And it was just your feedback is really, really important to us. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. Please do take a couple of minutes to share your thoughts on today's lunchtime learning session, and you can give us lots of ideas in terms of future topics. So there is a QR code there, and Joanna will also be sending the link to this out as well for everybody who was here. So I'm going to stop my sharing if I know how to do that. In fact, I don't, because I'm going to end up coming out of the session. So what I'd just really like to do is thank everybody today enormously, but particularly to Harry. Harry, thanks so much. You've been a fantastic communicator, and we hope to be able to invite you back in a few months' time when you've done the Cochrane review and you know, your ongoing work, in a huge well done. So thank you very much, everybody, today.